My guest today is the author of The Monsters Know What They Are Doing.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt, and I am your host. This is the podcast where we learn how to become better game masters and role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. Now, guys, I have an incredible interview today, but first, if you enjoy this podcast, I really need your help, guys. Please consider supporting it in some way. You can like, rate, review, or subscribe to it wherever you are listening to this podcast right now. Those things really help people find the show. Also, if you want me to continue producing episodes of this show and you have the means, please consider supporting the show financially. You can head over to patreon.com/dicegeeks and learn how to support the show there. I would greatly appreciate it. Now, here's the interview. My guest today is the author of The Monsters Know What They Are Doing and Live to Tell the Tale, Keith Ammann. Keith, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
How were you first introduced to Dungeons & Dragons?
I read about it in an issue of Games magazine in 1979. I was 10 years old, a bit of a puzzle fiend. I read about it, and it sounded fascinating. I prevailed upon my mother to buy me a copy of the Holmes Blue Box Basic Set, which she did, and we sat down with it together and could not for the life of us figure out what we were supposed to do with it. It took me quite a few years after that to fall in with a group of friends who had figured out how it worked and were playing regularly. And for a while I was hooked. These were the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons first edition days. And around the time of second edition, I started feeling more drawn to other role-playing games, in particular Shadowrun, which I think offered me a little bit more of the experience I was looking for, because I have always been more drawn to anchored high fantasy than wild wahoo high fantasy. You know, I like more of a compromise between the real world and the fantasy world. I don't like everything to just be well, it happens because magic, or it happens because fantasy. I like to have things explained. To me, that makes them feel more real to me. And so it was many, many years before I came back to Dungeons and Dragons. And by that point, the 5th edition had come out. My wife asked me if I would run a D&D game for her and some of her coworkers, and I agreed, and that's how I got back into it.
Okay. No, that's fantastic. I'm just wondering, what do you think it is about the tabletop role-playing games that captured your imagination?
Storytelling, exploration, discovery, problem solving. I think it's an intellectual game. It's an intellectual exercise, and I'm drawn to that sort of thing. I always have been, and I like the exercise of imagining what it's like to be someone else and putting myself into that character's head, that character's shoes, and trying to imagine how they might see a situation differently from how I would see that same situation. One of the things that I get a big kick out of, both as a player and as a dungeon master, is the exercise of epistemology, the differences between what different characters and creatures in the world know. Because that drives so much action. What you know, what you don't know, what you don't know that you don't know. Those things create really interesting complications and power dynamics. And I love playing with that.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And now you had mentioned, I'll follow up on that with that in a second. But you had mentioned, you had played D&D or finally got it figured out, and heaven knows I know what you're talking about, because I don't think I played by the rules until I played a game of 4E.
In those days we did not have the benefit really of D&D media. I mean, we had Dragon Magazine, but Dragon Magazine is not going to teach you how to play by example.
Yeah,
you're not watching somebody play in the pages of Dragon Magazine. You really needed someone who knew what they were doing to hold your hand and walk you through it. There was no other way to pick it up, and people often had it wrong.
Yeah.
In those days, I mean, there's it seemed like there were more exceptions to the rules than rules, and more house rules than published rules. And wherever you went, things were likely to happen a little bit differently.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's the ease of onboarding these days is a world apart from what it was like back then.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I just ran games like the person who ran my first game. I just ran games like he did, because I didn't know any other example. And then when I went and played with some other groups, I realized really quickly that they had different styles and had different rules and things like that. And so I think you're absolutely right that now, I mean, we could just, you can just hop on YouTube and watch somebody play the game, and and we have so many examples of play. But when back then it was, you just didn't have those examples. And now you had said that you were drawn into Shadowrun because it had explanations, and of course, Shadowrun.
Shadowrun is a little bit of Shadowrun. I mean, Shadowrun is anchored fantasy, but it's anchored fantasy with a lot of fantasy.
Sure.
And I think one of the things I liked was the combination of, there's crazy magic, there's all these fantasy elements, but you know what? Also, everybody in this world has 10 hit points. And it doesn't matter how experienced they are. It doesn't matter how weak they are, how tough they are. It doesn't matter what their class is. They have 10 hit points. It might be easier or harder to take those 10 hit points away from them. But ultimately, if you start losing hit points, your performance is degrading. And if you lose all your hit points, you're down. And that was a pretty big contrast to, D&D, where you get to a high enough level, your dwarf can fight a dozen orcs, drink a glass of poison, jump off a cliff, get up at the bottom, dust himself off, fight another half dozen orcs. And it's just, it gets absurd at some point, the ability to do this kind of stuff. And that bugs me less today than it did then, because now I'm like, well, this is just the nature of the game, and you can either rebel against it or you can just embrace it and go ham. And so I'm in more of an embrace it and go ham phase these days, but I do still favor the idea of creatures, even fantastic creatures, responding rationally to their circumstances and having a having a kind of ecological niche in the world and being adapted to fill it. And that is the place that the monsters know what they're doing came out of, because I want creatures to feel like they occupy the niche in the world that they occupy. I want them to behave accordingly. I don't want them to be indistinguishable. I also don't want them to feel out of place, feel like they're just something completely random that doesn't necessarily have any connection to the time or place where they are.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll talk about that more, I'm sure. And I just wanted to ask, did you play for a while before you started running games, or did you kind of start running games pretty quickly?
I played for a while first. The group I fell in with late in high school, early in college, there were 4 of us, and we had a party of 4. And the way we handled that is we rotated the DMing. And whenever one of us was DM, our player character was an NPC that traveled with the group. Mm-hmm. So my friend Julian was the first DM in the rotation, and then my friend Matt, and then my friend Byrne, and then I batted cleanup. And so I had 3 examples ahead of me before I took the reins for myself.
Oh, that's nice. And that is a really nice arrangement when you can switch the DMs around like that. That is really cool. So then I was going to follow up with when you were talking about what the different players or characters or creatures know in the worlds, know in the world that they inhabit. And you had started talking about that. And how they behave differently based on what they know. Could you maybe just give us, some examples, or how do you handle that when you're running a game, or what would that look like in a game?
I pay a lot of attention to that question during prep. And so I will in my own notes, I will say this person knows these things, or I'll just be aware of it because, like I'm running Curse of Strahd right now. So I've got kind of a running tally in my head of things Strahd knows about the party, things he can infer by interacting with them. He just had the player characters just had their first encounter with Strahd face to face. They are not yet at a level where they are ready to take him on. This is sort of this is sort of him flexing on them and figuring out, who he can turn, who's susceptible to this, and trying to feel them out in conversation. Who sasses him back, and who just kind of sits quietly and doesn't really say anything. And who of those people who are sitting quietly seems like they are very, very intentionally playing their cards close to their chest, and who is just like, man, I don't know, somebody else want to handle this? And then he knows who to try to charm. And he picked off 3 of them out of 5 in this most recent encounter, which was more than I expected him to be honest. I was counting on him charming 1. I thought maybe he'd charm 2. I did not expect him to successfully charm 3, but he pulled it off. And so now there's going to be the question of, as he learns more about them, is he going to decide that they make good agents, good thralls, or a good snack? And meanwhile, the other members of the party who were not charmed by him, they have to figure out now. They have no idea what's going to happen, and they know that their situation is much more fragile than it was before. And and they're going to have to work with that and figure out how they can deal with the situation and not get wiped out. But boy, other examples, things like Lost Mine of Phandelver. Spoilers, if anyone's not played the starter set, just kind of, go have a snack. When you first go into Cragmaw Cave, if you can successfully sneak up the garbage chute, then you can very, very easily take advantage of the fact that the goblins and their commander don't know you're there. And that can really swing things in your favor. If you go in through the front, make a racket, give yourself away, now they know you're there. They know that terrain. They know where the good hiding places are, where the good sniper posts are. They're going to wreck you. So you really have to get in there in such a way that they don't know you're there to have a strong chance of prevailing in that situation.
And I really like the way you frame it in the idea of what people know and the things, what they would know in that world. So I really like that.
And I mean, you can bring that. It's not just a combat thing. You bring that into social interaction with an NPC. It's a basic interrogation technique to act like you know certain things already, like you have proof of them, and the person you're interrogating doesn't know that you have that proof. They don't know if you have it or not.
Yeah.
But if they believe your act, then they might formulate different ideas about how much information they should give you.
Yeah.
And exploration. What you don't know can kill you.
I find that fascinating. I think it's a good framework that somebody could really think about. What do the people know? In each situation, what do these people know about their world and their combat or their social situation? What do people know about it?
And just to throw one more thing out there,
Sure.
I recently finished a Tyranny of Dragons campaign. So we played Horde of the Dragon Queen and then Rise of Tiamat. And there was a chapter in Rise of Tiamat that, I hate to say it, but for a couple of reasons, I just threw the entire chapter out. I said, we're not playing this. It's too messed up. I mean, number one, it treated a very sensitive topic without the appropriate sensitivity, and I didn't care for that. But the other thing was that the NPCs in this case were questioning the PCs and trying to get information from them. And the problem was that the campaign gave no that the adventure gave no indication whatsoever what those NPCs already knew. Gave no indication of what they were trying to find out from the PCs. It only said they're questioning them and they're doing it intelligently and aggressively. Okay, but what are they asking? How can you know what they're going to ask if you don't know what they know and what they don't know and what they are trying to find out, or if they're trying to get the PCs to lie to them and betray themselves, or what? You have no idea. And that makes that entire scene basically unplayable. You cannot have an interrogation without having some inkling of what the interrogator is trying to learn from it. And that was a major failing of that chapter of the adventure. I literally got angry about it and just said, forget this chapter. I'm not even bothering. I'm just going to hand wave it, say it didn't matter, and go on.
No, that's interesting. And I'm getting the sense here, as you're talking, do you spend a lot of time in prepping for each session?
I don't know that I spend an outlier amount of time.
Mm.
I do have to give a shout out to Mike Shea and his book, Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master. Not that I would consider myself a lazy dungeon master. I am the very opposite of a lazy dungeon master. I will, given a chance, I will always over-prepare. But one of the things I really like about that book is how it focuses your attention on the highest value things to prepare, the things to focus your preparation on that are going to give you the most payoff. Which is, those are things like getting off to a strong start in the session, knowing what kinds of secrets and clues characters might pick up over the course of an encounter, knowing who the NPCs are and what they know and what their interaction styles are, what their personalities are, their priorities, features in locations that the players are likely to encounter, and also details that will make fantastic locations feel fantastic. Just some salient details that make people go, whoa, okay, this place is really cool. Mm-hmm. Focusing the prep on those things. I've definitely found that I don't do less prep. I think Mike Shea's idea was that, you're doing too much prep. You don't need to do as much prep. You can just do this stuff. And I'm like, no, I still do the same amount of prep, but I'm prepping smarter. The things that I'm preparing are going to pay off for me more during the session. And of course, I being myself, one of the things I prepare is always what tactics the monsters are going to use in their combat encounter. And I to the extent that I script it out, or I give myself a little flow chart, because I do not want to burden myself with having to make those decisions on the fly. That's where things they stop making sense, because you get mentally overloaded trying to keep track of everything. It is much better to make as many decisions as you can in advance. And this is true for players and their characters, as well as it is for DMs. The more decisions you can make in advance of the game session, the smoother the session is going to go, especially during a combat encounter, which has so many moving parts. If you can, it makes everything so much more high speed, low drag. Even if you're not making absolute decisions like, I am going to do X, I am going to do Y, but at least, having rules for yourself, trigger situations. If this thing happens, then I'm going to do X. And being aware from that, being aware of that from the get-go. And then when the encounter is underway, all you have to do is notice when one of your triggering conditions comes up. It's like, oh yes, I remember I was going to use second wind when I got below half my hit points. And you don't even have to make the decision, you just do it. Because you made the decision already back when you had more time and more freedom to think about it and your adrenaline wasn't going.
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating. And of course, you gave a shout out to Mike Shea. Of course, I've interviewed him here on the podcast. And so people listening can go back and check out that episode. And we talk about his book, The Lazy Dungeon Master and the Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master. And of course, I myself have written a small book called The No Prep Game Master. So I fall on the no prep side. I do caveat that a little bit because, I've been playing since I was 9. And so a lot of my prep can just be, thinking about things, going through kind of my daily routine. But I kind of wrote from the point of view of somebody who, is working a full-time job, has a family, has, tons of responsibilities outside of it. And, their prep might be 10 minutes before their friends show up or log in, as it were.
Yeah. I would never do that because just too many things go wrong to me when you fly by the seat of your pants. But I'd say my prep to play ratio is about 1-to-1.
No, that's interesting, and I know everybody has different styles, and I'm trying to learn as well as through these interviews and talking to people. Just like I hope my audience is learning different ways of running games, and that. I would actually enjoy spending some time in prep, but it's just usually I just find that I can't do it. Or if I have a tendency, if I spend a lot of time prepping, I usually fall into the trap of really just railroading my players down something that I have thought about. So those are some of the reasons why I try to, not only did, my life kind of exclude a lot of prep time, a lot of availability to prep. I wanted to rid myself of just, railroading my characters and my players down, predetermined paths. So I jettisoned a lot of some baggage that I picked up maybe when I was a teenager and had too much time to think about things.
Well, I think one of the advantages of Mike Shea's lazy DM approach is that the things he focuses on are geared toward making sure that your campaign is a spiral rather than a straight line. That you can take detours, you can loop around. You are not forcing yourself to go from A to B to C to D. But you're not forcing your player characters to do that. But you are taking note of what is going to need to happen. And then you are making sure that you have a variety of different ways that you can allow those things to happen. So that even if, in a sense, your player characters are, visiting the Stations of the Cross, they at least feel like it was their choices that got them to each station. And so there's not so much of that, free will lacking feeling of just having to move forward in a straight line. It's just, oh yeah, you could go 3 different ways here, 4 different ways here, but each one is going to get you the same thing in the end. But hey, it was your choice that got you to it, so it's a little bit of stagecraft there, but it works. And
I've definitely gotten into one of my key tips for people is if you're running without prepped, or without a lot of prep anyway, is always to listen to your players, because they'll tell you things about where they want to go and what they're interested in, just while they're talking at the table. And I always let people know, listen to what they're saying, take some of what they're saying and use it in different ways, because they will give you, especially if you have active players, they will give you so much to work with, that it's just sometimes unbelievable if you have your ear kind of out and listening to the table. But anyway, you had mentioned that your wife had asked you to run a session, so you started running 5e, but you at some point you weren't just running 5e again, you had started a blog and were writing actively about it. Isn't that right?
Mm-hmm. Well, that was a direct offshoot of that campaign that my wife asked me to dungeon master, because we had a false start. We were running Lost Mine of Phandelver. The first time we ran it, we had a 60% mortality rate, And it's like, okay, rewind. We're going to try this again, create new characters if you want, or play the same one again if you don't want. We're just going to run the same scenario again, see if we can do a little bit better this time. But one of the things that I felt from the first run through is that I just didn't feel like the combat with the goblins was satisfying. There was something lacking in it for me, and I didn't know how. Well, it came back to epistemology again. I didn't know how goblins fight, but goblins know how goblins fight. So I had to get into the head of a goblin somehow and understand how they see what they can do and how they have learned to make use of what they do. And I was also in a place where I had not done any writing for a long time. I used to be a professional editor, and I wrote for an alternative news weekly in upstate New York. But I had not done any writing for a long time, and I wanted to get back into it. And I was also thinking about my own, how am I going to analyze this creature to figure out what it can do and how it uses what it can do. And I don't remember exactly how it happened, but I merged the two things together. I decided that this was going to be the topic that I would write on. And it just took off from there. The goblins were, of course, the first analysis that I wrote. They were a good entry level humanoid enemy. They appear in the starter set, so they were the one that I had trouble with. So it seemed like a natural place to start, and it just took off from there. I just kept going and going and going through as much of the monster manual as I could get through, and eventually did the whole thing, and then started moving on to other books. And so, it really took on a life of its own. I didn't realize what kind of phenomenon it was becoming until I started noticing spikes in my hit statistics that seemed to correspond with posts on Reddit. And what I found out going back there is somebody would say, "Hey, I'm not really sure how to run an owl bear. What should I do?" Or, and somebody else would say, "Read the monsters know what they're doing. He says what you should do." I'm like, wow, people are actually using this as a reference work. Mm-hmm. Okay, that feels pretty good. But it wasn't until I was approached by an editor at a trade publisher that I seriously considered trying to publish those analyses as a book. I actually kind of had to be coaxed into doing it, because my original thinking was that it just didn't seem like something I ought to do, and I needed somebody to tell me that I ought to do it before I seriously considered it at all. Glad I did.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems like you started right around the same time, the right time, because 2015, 2016, Dungeons and Dragons just started skyrocketing in popularity. And that is about the same time when I kind of coincidentally started self-publishing some of my books, and really discovered that there was a hungry audience out there. So now, you were saying, the monsters know what they were doing, and you started with goblins. Maybe just to give an example to the listeners, what did you learn about goblins and how they are fighting, or how they would fight when they're confronted with a band of adventurers?
They have a short bow and a scimitar, and you can almost entirely forget about the scimitar, because everything in their kit works together to make them hit and run attackers. They don't want to get into melee. They're not tough enough. They are not effective enough out in the open. What they are really good at is sniping, hiding, popping out to shoot, running somewhere else, hiding again, popping out to shoot, and just taking pot shot after pot shot after pot shot and trying to stay hidden in between turns so that you can't fight back. That is the basic Goblin modus operandi, and it is extremely effective. It is so effective that if a group of level 1 player characters start to panic, they're going to get wrecked. You really, to fight back against them, you really have to take cover, ready your attacks, and keep an eye out for them. And when they pop out, then get them. Because if you try to run after them, or if there's just not much you can do against their strategy other than play it cool, stay undercover, and wait for them to reveal themselves. They are just too good otherwise. And really, the only time they have a reason to use their scimitars is when they are ambushing you in tight quarters. As long as there's any kind of open area with places they can hide, it's hide, shoot, hide, again and again and again. And they are very effective that way. And if you treat all your low-level humanoids, the same, if you treat goblins and kobolds and orcs and lizard folk and gnolls, if you treat them all the same, you're not going to get the best out of each one. I mean, I don't know, lizard folk you might get the best out of because they're not very sophisticated, but every one of them is a little bit different. And goblins in particular have that one niche where closing in and hacking and slashing is a bad idea for them. Works great for an orc, does not work well for a goblin.
Yeah. So how would you say you wouldn't use the same approach for a kobold? What would they do?
Kobolds, first of all, they have pack tactics, so they're going to swarm. They are best close up in contrast to the goblins, which are better at range. However, because kobolds are weak and they need their numbers to survive, they need something just a little bit extra. And so fighting on their own home turf is what gives them that advantage. Because they're small, so the passages are small, so medium-sized creatures have trouble pursuing them through those tunnels. They'll get stuck and have to squeeze. It'll be dark down there because the kobolds like it better in the dark. They have sunlight sensitivity. They don't want to be out in the broad daylight. They want to be underground. So you've either got to have dark vision or give yourself away with a light source so they know you're coming. They can, have branching little tunnels all over the place so they can come at you from multiple directions at once. They'll put traps in and, you don't know where you're going. So you don't know, what kind of traps you're going to walk into. They do. They know their way around. It's their home turf. So the old tale about Tucker's kobolds, if people aren't familiar with that, they should Google it. That's how you run kobolds. They stick to their home turf where they have all the advantages and they play dirty.
And I know when I first, discovered your work on your blog and then in your book, I found it really fascinating to see your take on some of the tactics there, and it really just kind of helped explain some different things. But now, you said you went through the entire monster manual. I have to ask, what was like some creature that you were just like, oh, come on. Like, what would this even do? Was there just some creature that like just totally like stumped you for a little while?
Stumped me? No. Disappointed me? Yes. troglodytes,
Okay.
crawling claws. There are one or two others.
What was the issue?
That you can basically just run them on autopilot. They can't do anything.
Oh, okay. Okay, so like a troglodyte?
Troglodytes' only distinctive features are passive, so they don't affect their tactics in any way. They smell bad. If you get close to them, you start retching. Well, that doesn't change what they do. They were going to be brute melee attackers anyway, so that doesn't change anything about them. Troglodyte, I talk about how if you're not thinking about the tendency is just to go bash, 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 or stab, 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 or whatever. But for troglodytes, that's all they do. It's all they can do. They got nothing else. Ogres, cyclopes, they don't have much in their kits. But just because those monsters are not interesting doesn't absolve the DM of having to make an encounter with one of them interesting if they choose to have an encounter with one of them. You got to make the encounter interesting somehow, even if the monster is not interesting. So you have to pull out the other tricks in the toolbox for that.
So how would you do that? How would you make a troglodyte encounter interesting?
Environmental things going on, some other creature crashing the party. Maybe it's a matter of just maybe they're not so much an enemy, but rather a hazard or an obstacle. They're just something you got to get past or get around. You want to try to retrieve something without engaging them if possible. Something like that. You have to add another wrinkle because the combat itself is not going to be that rewarding. You have to find some other way to make the experience rewarding.
So in addition to the monsters know what they're doing, you also have a book, Live to Tell the Tale. Tell us about that.
Well, that arose when people started telling me that they were using my tactics and getting total party kills from them. And I was saying, yeah, that's not what I was going for. I mean, I want these monsters to be effective, but in the sense that you're getting their full value out of them, not that you're making your players miserable by massacring their darlings. So I realized that it would be necessary to balance the scales. If the monsters are smarter, we have to help the players be smarter too in piloting their characters, and also share with them some of the techniques that allow dungeon masters to reduce their own cognitive load, because players outnumber dungeon masters 4, 5, 6, 7 to 1. And if the dungeon master is slow, then the dungeon master is slow. But if the players are slow, multiply that by how many players you've got at the table. That can really, really bog combat down. And it can make it less fun for the players because they're not getting those moments of awesome that come out of using their characters' features effectively and in ways that multiply their effectiveness. And so I originally wrote Live to Tell the Tale as an ebook that I was selling off my own website. And when I was approached to do The Monsters Know What They're Doing as a trade book, I took Live to Tell the Tale and transformed it into that format as well.
That is something that I was thinking about too. Like you were saying, if the monsters are smarter and they're using tactics, you can see how that could overpower, some players if they're just kind of swinging their swords, or
right.
casting a few spells here and there. So what was some of your advice in the book that to kind of help players overcome some of that?
Well, I talk a lot about advantage and disadvantage. I talk a lot about the debilitating conditions and how important they are to the game. It's really kind of odd that they're relegated to an appendix in the player's handbook because they are hugely important. They should be part of Chapter 9, or at least, maybe closer to Chapter 9. But that stuff is really, really important. The class and subclass features that have decision making attached to them.
Mm-hmm.
How to use stealth and perception. In the revised edition, what to do in mounted combat if you're actually doing that. It's hard to bring Horsey into a dungeon crawl, but every once in a while, you might have a party where the paladin has their faithful steed and they like to use it, and you've got actually enough room to use it, and so that becomes a factor. Choosing spells, because spells are a huge source of analysis paralysis. It's very, very important if you are a spellcaster to go through your spells and come up with one or two criteria that will tell you this is when you need to cast this spell. If this criteria is not met, don't consider this spell. Just don't even look at it. Skip past it. Cast it when this happens and only when this happens. And do that, make yourself like a little reference for each one of your spells, because so much time is wasted trying to choose spells when, quite frankly, certain spells just are not applicable to the situation. So you need to... it's like when you're playing chess. One of the first things you need to do on each move is ask yourself, can my opponent give check against me? Can my opponent capture anything of mine? Is my opponent about to set me up in a tactical combination? If you see that any one of those three things is going to happen, then whatever it was you wanted to do, you got to put that on the back burner and not even think about for a moment, because you have to stop your opponent from doing that thing. That's the more important priority. Now, if you can somehow do that and what you wanted to do at the same time, beautiful. Choose that move. But if you were looking at a candidate move and it does not stop the check that your opponent can put you in, you have to eliminate that candidate move. It's no longer a candidate because you've got to stop the check. That's the most important thing. You reduce yourself to only looking at moves that stop the check. And then you choose the best move out of those. It's the same with spells. You don't look at the spells that don't apply to the situation. And the way you decide which spells are going to apply to what situations is by taking a little time outside the game session and just thinking about it. Make yourself some notes, carry those notes into the session. Hey, now you don't have to think about them during the session. You saved yourself the trouble and the confusion and the cognitive burden, and you saved everybody else some time.
Yeah, no, I think that's great advice. And actually, just not too long ago, I had to write on a piece of paper, like in huge letters. It was like, my character has stone's endurance, and like circle it, because I'm like, I totally forgot about that, and it would have helped me in one situation. And it's just like, I'm just not used to playing that kind of character. I'm playing something new, and it's just like, so I had to write a huge note about that, because that would have helped in a certain situation. But no, I think that's some great advice. And so now you have those two books. What does the future hold? Do you have something else coming out?
November 30th, more monsters know what they're doing. These are the creatures from Volo's Guide to Monsters and Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes.
Okay.
Along with some other just side thoughts about running the game. And after that, I'm working on a book titled How to Defend Your Lair. And this is going to go into tactical principles independent from rules, much more so than the Monsters No books did, because the Monsters No books are really focused very specifically on these creatures in this game, in this edition of this game. how to defend your lair is going to discuss things in a D&D concept, but the principles that I'm going to discuss do have application beyond 5th edition D&D.
No, that sounds really, really interesting. I think that's always, when you have a beholder in its lair, what is it doing? It's going to do something different because it's in its lair. It just doesn't, gain a few extra and make slime or whatever on the floor. It's doing that for some reason, right? Because this is its home. This is its place. Yeah. Yeah. Really, really interesting.
Combining that with the epistemology thing again.
Yeah.
There was a side quest I created for my players that I set up by having them. I foreshadowed it for some time. I telegraphed it a long way off. Then it finally kicked in. Everywhere they were going, they were finding that places were running out of salt. And what it turned out when they followed the leads is that all of the salt was going to one place. It was being bought up by dominated agents of a mind flayer that was trying to create a large brine pool that it could bring an elder brain into. And when they and it had also managed to cast Gesh on a beholder and get it to guard its lair for it. And so there was a room that you had to go to get to the chamber where the mind flayer was doing all this. And if you went into this chamber, there's the beholder. It's going to attack. But if you started going toward the inner exit door, the beholder was under a Gesh. It had to go down and block that door. It was compelled to. It was forced to. So it wasn't defending its own lair. It had this compulsion that it was under. But the first time the party reached this point, they beat the beholder, but it petrified two of them. And so they had to retreat temporarily and find somebody who could undo the petrifaction. And this took them out of the way for, I think, 5 or 6 days. When they got back to the cave, suddenly there is a giant semicircle of commoners arrayed in front of the cave entrance, and every single one of them is just standing there looking outward. So there's no way now to get to the cave without being seen by one of these commoners who's going to start yelling body snatchers style once they see someone. And if you try to get through them, you're killing commoners. It's a so it literally using many of the commoners that it had dominated as human shields. Because mind flayers are not dumb. If they realize that somebody tried to break into their lair and mess with what they were doing, they're going to beef up security. It's not going to be just the exact same thing as it was when you left. You're going to come back and the security is going to be increased because now the mind flayer knows. So that's a case where the new information results in a change in how it's guarding its assets.
Yeah. No, I really like that. That was a great example. And I guess, just maybe one final question here is just, what does it feel like to take a hobby into, writing books from a major publisher and stuff? What does that feel like?
Bonkers. I mean, it feels good, but it's bonkers.
Yeah.
I got to be honest. I mean, I'm proud of what I did. I enjoy creating it. I appreciate and I'm grateful for the positive response that I have gotten. And also, there are a lot of people out there who have worked and continue to work way harder than I do and have not gotten the amazing lucky break that I did. And they are every bit as deserving as I am, if not more so. And so I hope that every one of them eventually is able to enjoy a comparable level of success, and that that they get what they deserve. Because I honestly, I feel like I've gotten more than I deserve, and I'm grateful for it. But I don't want to delude myself into thinking that I was more deserving of this break than anyone else. This was luck to such an extent. I mean, I did good work, but I also got really, really lucky. And there are lots of other people who do work just as good and haven't been as lucky as I have been. So I wish them all the luck in the world.
All right. Well, where can people find your books and read more about what the monsters are doing?
They are trade books, so they are available at any bookstore, independent bookstores, IndieBound, bookshop.org, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, wherever. They are published by Saga Press, which is an imprint of Simon & Schuster. Friendly local game stores can obtain copies through Simon & Schuster distribution if they don't have a relationship with a trade book distributor. All of these links are at my home website, spyandowl.com. One word solid, no punctuation in there except for the dot. And the blog is at themonstersknow.com. It's been on hiatus for a while as I try to finish up the books that I'm working on, which is taking way longer than I meant it to. Sorry, readers. It's been a while since I've posted anything on there, but I will get back to it eventually, promise. And on Twitter at Keith Ammann.
Okay. And I will make sure that I put links to your books and to your websites and to your Twitter in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So anybody who's listening right now can just head over to dicegeeks.com and check out the show notes for this episode, and you will find the links for Keith's book. Well, Keith, it was a pleasure getting to speak with you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you again for inviting me.
All right, there you go, guys. I really hope you enjoyed my conversation with Keith today. He brings some really great insights into helping us make our games better. If you head over to dicegeeks.com, find the show notes for this episode, you will find links to Keith's blog, to his books, and trust me, you want to check them out. Okay. If you want some free stuff, head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You get 10 free dungeon maps. You'll never miss an episode of this show. And each and every Friday, you'll get an email update from me letting you know what is going on here at Dice Geeks. All right, guys, I gave the pitch at the top. Again, I really need your help to keep this show going. If you want to rate, review, subscribe, or like the show in your favorite pod player, please do so. Those things help the show immensely. Also, you can tell your friends about the show. You can share it on social media or let just let other people know. I mean, really, guys, you can just talk to people. I mean, that's still a thing people do, I guess. I don't know. Any support is greatly appreciated. Also, again, you can support the show financially at patreon.com/dicegeeks. All right, guys. As always, it is my pleasure to come to you each and every Wednesday with a new fantastic interview about role-playing games or storytelling. So, until next Wednesday, keep gaming!